Hello! In 2021, Zack Snyder's Justice League sent shockwaves across the globe. I found the story of how this film came to be very interesting, not only for its ramifications on modern media and public relations, but also its familiarity. In this video, I want to go through what led to two versions of the same film being released in such a short space of time, what effect both films and the event as a whole had, and what kind of bearing a film from nearly 100 years ago has on it all. So allow me to tell you, dear viewer, about Justice League, its recreation, and greed. Let us begin. In March of 2016, the film Batman vs Superman: Dawn of Justice was released in cinemas. This was the second film in what would become the DC Extended Universe, otherwise known as the DCEU. Its sequel, Justice League, began filming shortly after, with Zack Snyder returning to direct. Justice League would follow the story of characters set up in the previous film: Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Aquaman, and Cyborg. The plot would center around an alien threat to destroy the world, and the main characters forming the namesake of the film, the Justice League, to stop it. Filming for Justice League took place between April and December 2016, but before filming had even started, issues began to bloom. Batman vs Superman was not released unchallenged. In the same year and month, Captain America: Civil War was released by the competing comic book film franchise Marvel. Initially assumed to be the weaker of the two releases, Civil War went on to be far more popular and received far more positive critical acclaim. Warner Brothers, the company financing Justice League, took note of this positive reception and began making changes. Suicide Squad, the third film in the DCEU, was made to reshoot to make it more light-hearted and upbeat, in line with its Marvel competitors. Changes included adding a plethora of licensed music, removing a considerable amount of Joker scenes.
I am not someone who is loved.
And replacing one of the protagonists, who was originally going to be Steppenwolf. He would go on to be the main protagonist of Justice League, and his inclusion in Suicide Squad would have made for some much needed connectivity with the DCEU. Rumour had it they even spent time making Harley Quinn's short shorts even shorter. Apparently a lot of time was spent adjusting Suicide Squad. This was in spite of the fact the film was releasing a mere 4 months after Batman vs Superman in August of 2016. Suicide Squad would foreshadow Justice League as, after its release, it was described as a mess of editing and tone, which was put down to the significant reshoots and rewrites. Then all eyes were set on Justice League. Warner Brothers told Snyder and Terrio the film needed to be lighter in tone and more optimistic, a significant contrast to Zack Snyder's work if Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman were anything to go by. But these traits were no longer wanted in comparison to the much more funny, colourful, and financially lucrative competition. One significant indicator of this change was Superman's suit. Snyder originally wanted Superman to wear black to coincide with the Death of Superman comic, which he had just put to film in Batman vs Superman. But he had to revert to the red and blue suit to please executives. Sometime after filming was finished in late 2016, Warner Brothers executives watched an initial draft of the Justice League. There were several versions of the film that Snyder had to hand, the longest of which was 5 hours long, but the version shown to the executives was only 2.5 hours. They were apparently not pleased with what they saw. Warner Brothers considered the film to still be too long, too dark, and too humorless, ordering reshoots and rewrites just like with Suicide Squad. They even went as far as to bring in Joss Whedon, who had written and directed some of the Marvel films, to help with the writing. Whedon was apparently approaching Warner Brothers with an idea for a Batwoman film, and Warner Brothers took the opportunity to wrangle Whedon into the Justice League. If only he knew. Work continued on Justice League until March 2017, when Zack Snyder had a family tragedy. Both Zack and his wife Deborah continued to work on Justice League until May 2017, when they stepped down. Rumour has it Zack was forced to stop working to the point of being fired, but the official story is he left voluntarily to mourn. Either way, this left the film without a director. Warner Brothers, seeing an opportunity once again, looked to Joss Whedon. Brought on to assist with the rewrites and having worked with Snyder on initial reworks, Whedon now found himself in the director's chair of a film slated to come out in only 4 months' time. On top of this, he was also forced to work to mandates Snyder had ignored. Make the film happier, more colourful, and to a time limit. This led to a round of reshoots that cost an extra $25 million, bringing the total cost of the film up to $300 million, much higher than Batman vs Superman. Actors were brought back after they thought everything was done, with Batman's actor Ben Affleck looking suntanned and carrying some extra weight, and Superman's actor Henry Cavill having grown a moustache for another film he was currently filming. The reshoots were apparently dogged with negativity, with many of the actors complaining about the way they were treated on set, which wouldn't help things as time went on. Plot lines, subplots, characters, even pieces of retained scenes were removed, replaced with expositionary dialogue. Even some of the main characters were totally changed. Cyborg, one of the heroes of the film, was changed to avoid, as it was reportedly said, being an angry black man. All of this was carried out within the original time frame, as Warner Brothers refused to change the release date of the film to accommodate the drastic changes. All of this culminated in November 2017 with the release of Justice League to general audiences. The film was what the studio executives had asked for. The same could not be said of audiences. Just like Suicide Squad that preceded it, Justice League was a mess of writing, editing, tone, you name it. Justice League's worldwide box office ended up being $750 million short of breaking even. It was a flop of epic proportions. After the disappointing release, many were quick to point out how much of the original Justice League was cut out. 90%, 85%, even 10% were offered as estimates of what was left over from the original work. Zack Snyder himself estimated that only 25% of the film was still in the theatrical version. Along with this came the finger-pointing, most of which fell on Joss Whedon. Every complaint about Justice League was laid firmly at his feet. Gratuitous bum shots, Amazon bikini armor, awkward dialogue, nonsensical events, all were down to the change in director. With these proclamations, there were calls for Zack Snyder's version of Justice League, the Snyder Cut, to be released. This expectation of an alternative cut of the film was garnered from previous films releasing their own extended or director's cuts. In particular, an extended version of Batman vs Superman was released, adding 30 minutes of runtime, bolstering the film's plot. Despite expectations though, as far as anyone knew at the time, the Snyder Cut was only a pipe dream. Nevertheless, #release the Snyder Cut made its way around the internet. And here is where we go back in time, nearly 100 years. Back to when films were still considered an art form above all else, or at least they were just about hanging on to the moniker. Greed was a film released in 1924 based on the 1899 book McTeague. The story centered around a normal family winning the lottery and the disastrous effects it had on them. To give you an idea of what the film is like, spoiler warning for a 100-year-old film, the last scene of Greed has the main character handcuffed to a dead policeman in the middle of a desert with a bag of gold, an empty water canteen, and his wife's body draped over a horse. So yeah, happy-go-jolly film. The director was Erich von Stroheim, and he considered himself to be an artist. When making Greed, he ignored many of the restrictions thrust upon him by the Goldwyn Company, the studio financing the project, and made the film exactly how he liked. He wanted to make a gritty, realistic film without the glitz and glamour of Hollywood stardom or flashy sets. As such, not one scene of Greed was filmed in a studio. Instead, filming on location on the streets of San Francisco, 3,000 feet down in a mine shaft, and in the middle of Death Valley, 100 miles from civilization. All for the sake of realism and artistic integrity. I'm sure the actors loved it. Such an artistic vision did Stroheim have that long before colour or even sound was envisioned to be in film, he was colouring in the gold ores and coins in the film, frame by agonising frame. In total, 85 hours of footage was filmed for Greed, which Stroheim spent a year editing down to a more conservative yet still staggering 8 hours. This edit was given a private screening, and the dozen people who saw it praised it as the best film they had ever seen. Stroheim did eventually cut the runtime of Greed by half, much to his annoyance, whilst others tried to make shorter versions. Despite the efforts of everyone involved, no cut of the film could be agreed upon for cinemas. Then, in April 1924, the Goldwyn Company merged with 2 other studios to become Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, or more commonly known as MGM. Stroheim found his masterpiece in the hands of producer Irving Thalberg, a man who had fired Stroheim from his previous studio, and for whom no love was lost. Thalberg, unconcerned with artistic integrity, chopped Greed down to a more studio-pleasing 2.5 hours. Subplots and characters were entirely removed, and even scenes that were kept in were cut down for time, with title cards inserted to make up for lost plot. Before this, directors were treated as artists, reels of film their canvases, the films themselves their paintings. Thalberg cutting Greed like this was historically significant, as this was the first time a studio and producer had had the final say on a film over a director, on a work of art over the artist. Just like Justice League, Greed was an adaptation of a literary work. Just like Justice League, the film adaptation was filmed with a particular passion and vision. Just like Justice League, studio meddling would cut into the finished work and morph it into what the executives desired. Just like Justice League, Greed would open in cinemas to incredibly negative reviews. And just like Zack Snyder would, Stroheim, despondent with the outcome of his work, would distance himself from the theatrical version of Greed. But unlike Greed, whose original full-length manifestation has long since been lost to time, the original Justice League would have its time in the sun. In 2019, 2 years after Justice League had been released, Zack Snyder himself would upload a photo of rolls of tapes confirming the existence of another cut of the film. Snyder's version of Justice League was, according to the man himself, basically done, with only a few visual effects to be finalised. Even so, there was a problem. Snyder's original cut of the film had not been what Warner Brothers had been after, and probably still wasn't. The likelihood of the film being put to screen was looking low. That was until a certain global epidemic forced many to stay at home and boosted the popularity of internet-based media streaming services. Suddenly, the studio had an opportunity to please fans and advertise their own streaming platform at the same time. With mounting pressure from fans, with support from the film's actors and other celebrities, and with a possible avenue of distribution now available, in February of 2020, Zack Snyder was given the okay to finish his version of Justice League. In May 2020, Zack Snyder announced to excited fans that the film would be released the next year. In October, work began with a budget of $70 million, pushing the total budget of Justice League to $370 million. In August, a trailer was released, the song Hallelujah playing over the new visuals, teasing the fans with the God-given glory of the Snyder Cut. The trailer showed a new aspect ratio for the film that was in line with Zack Snyder's original artistic vision, and it was revealed a version of the film was going to be released sans colours, called the Justice is Grey edition. A poster appeared, similar to that of the original Justice League, but now in black and white to emphasise the marked change of tone between the two films and the alternate version that would be available. And Superman was going to be dressed in his black costume, just how Zack Snyder originally wanted. In January 2021, editing of the film was completed, and in March, Zack Snyder's Justice League was released onto streaming services and the world. The Snyder Cut of Justice League and its incredible runtime promised much to expectant fans. Previously cut characters would be added back in and more focus would be given to character development. Scenes that were trimmed down would be fully restored. Confusing plots would have their original context. CGI that was rushed would now be fully realised. And films which followed on from 2017 would now be closer in continuity to the DCEU, with the subversion of the Justice League and the inclusion of the Snyder Cut. So, with all that said, was it worth all the time, effort and ag for all of us to get to see the original, longer version of Justice League? To answer this, I'm going to go back to greed for a moment. Although few people saw the original 8-hour monster of a film, we do have impressions of what it might have been like. Stroheim was described as an obsessive for detail. Nothing puts this into perspective more than one scathing critic describing one of Greed's shorter cuts as Stroheim trying to put every comma of every page from the book onto the screen. Another described Stroheim's artistic whims leading to odd choices of camera angles and his obsession with close-ups on the actors' faces. But possibly the most damning description was from one of the dozen or so witnesses of the original work. When asked about what they saw, one viewer described how the film opened by following the main characters around on an average day in their lives for 45 minutes. That's 45 minutes where the film is drumming into you how normal and average these characters' lives are before anything happens. We can only imagine how tedious the other 7 hours and 50 minutes of the film would have been. Looking at the details of Greed now, it may have made for a great television series, but this was at a time when streaming and television wasn't even a dream. This was one madly obsessive director's pet project, and nothing was going to get in the way of it. Just like Snyder would almost a century later, Stroheim ignored mandated time constraints, the viability or want for a film of such length. He made what he wanted to make regardless of its feasibility to be shown to the public, and, therefore, make its money back. He wanted to make what he wanted to make, and damn all other considerations. This lack of a grip on the reality of the film industry would lead Greed to ruin, but at least you could say Stroheim was sticking to his artistic guns. Back to the Snyder Cut. I mentioned earlier that there were multiple versions of Zack Snyder's Justice League, with the longest version being 5 hours. Initially, this makes one wonder how much more of the film there is to be seen and whether we will get yet another version of it. But just like Stroheim had 85 hours of footage and ended up with an 8-hour film, so too does 5 hours of footage not make a Snyder Cut. In fact, according to Snyder himself, the film was never meant to be that long. In an interview, Snyder stated the films should be about 20 minutes longer each time. Obviously, what we ended up with didn't match this goal, as Man of Steel is 2 hours and 20 minutes, and Batman vs Superman is 2 hours and 30 minutes, or at least the original versions were. But if this is the sort of length Snyder was aiming for, where did the 4-hour runtime of the Snyder Cut come from? A lot of scenes that were in the theatrical cut of Justice League had a lot of material restored to them. Then there's the scenes that weren't in the theatrical version at all. The Flash's car crash scene, Cyborg's story, Superman's death cry, Steppenwolf and Darkseid interactions, Cyborg's visions, the nightmare, the Martian Manhunter chat. All of these fill up the runtime, but going back to my question from before, were all these changes worth it? The Flash's new, or I suppose old, scene shows off his powers but doesn't add much character-wise that isn't developed in other scenes, and adds nothing to the plot. It does add some mind-boggling logistics. I mean, this woman saw the Flash, she absolutely did.
Gosh, I hope everyone's okay. Gosh, I hope everyone's okay.
The new opening recontextualizes the whole reason for the plot to happen. It also goes on, and on, and on. It is especially frustrating watching that one Amazon shuffling towards the mother box. What about the Cyborg scenes? They develop his character far more than Justice League did, as well as his father's. But they also add some questionable capabilities that cause issues. For instance, Cyborg can control machines at will, but lets his father be killed by one. Such things bring into question what we've been told about Cyborg's abilities, or worse, his character. Then there's the existing scenes. A quick search online shows many people have made side-by-side comparisons of the theatrical Justice League and the Snyder Cut. These comparisons show how many scenes from Justice League are present in the Snyder Cut, and how much extra time they take up. The terrorists walk down corridors and up stairs and up more stairs and down more corridors. The heroes slowly trudging their way up a staircase. The janitor slowly but surely taking 4 times as long to discover Mr. Bugman. And so on, and so forth. These extended scenes don't add anything new to the plot or characters. They are just longer. Justice League cut the existing scenes down to make them snappier and take up less of the audience's time. The Snyder Cut presented them seemingly unedited, stretching them to their full time-wasting capacity. Justice League also removed existing scenes, in some cases to the detriment of the film, but in others to its benefit. The Snyder Cut adding them back in shows what we missed, but also what we didn't. Notice in this list of existing scenes I didn't mention stuff like the Nightmare or the Martian Manhunter or everything to do with Darkseid. These are not cut scenes that have been restored. These are new scenes that have been spliced in to tell a new tale. You can normally tell which scenes are new by the framing in the aspect ratio of Zack Snyder's artistic vision. The 4:3 or 1:33:1 ratio was apparently Snyder's original vision, having filmed everything on 35mm film. This is proven by comparison videos which show the existing scenes comfortably fit inside both the cinematic and artistic ratios. The same can't be said for the new scenes. It's clear the original shots were made with widescreen in mind, leaving plenty of headspace to be cut off. The new scenes weren't, and were made to fill up the 4:3 screen. which tells us they weren't filmed for the cinema, which tells us these aren't original. And as soon as you realise this, you then have to ask yourself, why? The theatrical release of Justice League was considered a bad film, and many attributed the awfulness to studio meddling and the change of director. One unfortunate side effect of the Snyder Cut is the realisation that a lot of the problems people had with Justice League carry over. The arse shots, the bikini armour, awkward dialogue and nonsensical events are all still present. If anything, more of it was added. Being aware of the resentment surrounding the theatrical release and the assumptions made about who was to blame for it, it's clear that changes were made to distance the Snyder Cut from the original Justice League. The more stuff that gets added, the more the two versions of the film differ. All of which seems to have been added or re-added at the expense of existing content. When the Snyder Cut was announced, it was stated by the people who made them that the other DCEU films would coincide more accurately with Snyder's vision. And yet, when watching the Snyder Cut, all I can think about was the continuity clashes. The Atlanteans being unable to talk underwater and being able to breathe out of it. Aquaman using trident abilities that he didn't learn until after Justice League. Aquaman being a moody get compared to his happy-go-jolly self in his own film. And Wonder Woman referencing her seclusion from the world when Wonder Woman 1984 is a thing. There was a goal when bringing the Snyder Cut to fruition, and it wasn't to make sense. In 1924 and 2017, the films Greed and Justice League were released into cinemas. They were cut-up editorial messes compared to their original works, and flopped in the box office, their respective directors disassociating themselves from the Frankenstein monsters that were once their pet projects. In 1924, Stroheim could only move on, and accepted film would never see the light of day. In 2021, Snyder was given the opportunity to re-release Justice League as per his original artistic vision. If Stroheim could be transported to the modern day with his film intact, it is possible he might have been allowed to do the same. But herein lies the difference. Stroheim had the artistic integrity to stick to his guns and not sully his work, even to his and its detriment. Snyder, on the other hand, balked at the criticism the theatrical version of his film received. The 8-hour Greed film we would have got to see would have been Stroheim's original artistic vision, whereas Snyder seemed determined to alter his film as much as possible to get it away from what audiences were already familiar with. The result of this attempted distancing is that the so-called Snyder Cut of Justice League is as much Snyder's original artistic vision for the film as the theatrical cut. Both films are as similar and different from what was reported as Snyder's work in 2017. But the need to be different didn't just add stuff to the Snyder Cut, it removed genuinely good scenes from the theatrical cut. The epitome of this is Superman's arrival in the final fight. In the Snyder Cut, he swoops in, says one line, and the fight starts. The scene is visually consistent and pleasing, especially compared to the theatrical version and the CGI jelly lip hiding Henry Cavill's facial hair. But beyond that, it isn't very impactful, and Superman's single line is uninspiring to say the least.
Not impressed.
Compare this to the theatrical version.
You're all too weak to see the truth.
Well, I believe in truth, but I'm also a big fan of justice.
This is cheesy as all bloody hell, but it's much preferred over the bland intro of the Snyder Cut. Snyder has admitted in the past he doesn't like his superheroes talking to each other.
I kind of came to the conclusion also that they couldn't really talk in their suits with any credibility. You know what I mean?
Okay.
They more than 4 or 5 lines, and you start to notice, like, wait, these are two guys dressed up. One guy's dressed up like a bat, and the other one has a big red S on his chest, and they're being super serious about how mad they are at each other. And it just, you can, it's just, it's a dangerous thing,
Potentially, this attitude led to this line and others not being carried over. If so, it took away some much needed characterful moments from the film. Potentially, the Snyder Cut could be edited to be a hybrid of it and the 2017 version. Trim the scenes down to match the theatrical cut. Remove the new scenes that weren't original, like the nightmare. Keep the old scenes that were originally removed, like the car crash and cyborg story. Potentially keep the story beats. And keep some of the character moments inserted in the theatrical cut, with the colours toned down, obviously. This potential new film could be better than either the theatrical or Snyder Cut of Justice League. But honestly, I personally still think it wouldn't be good. Despite the changes both versions of Justice League brought to the table, neither changed the real problem with the film: the story. I mentioned before that the basic plot is about an alien invasion and heroes trying to stop them. A good basis for a story, but the more threads of the Justice League's tale you pull, the more it unravels. Many people have torn into these films for their bad story, so I won't go too in-depth here. But to give you an idea of how many issues there are, let's examine one thing: how the world-ending devices, the mother boxes, work. In both films, the mother boxes activate and summon the alien Steppenwolf to retrieve them and begin the world-ending process. In the 2017 film, it was a global feeling of hopelessness after Superman's death that caused the boxes to activate. This assumes that no other time over the past several thousand years did the whole world feel scared or hopeless. I'm sorry, but even in recent memory there have been examples of just that. Steppenwolf would have come back many times over before the forming of the Justice League. But that's one version of the story. The 2021 film made it, so Superman's death scream woke the boxes. This only shifts the issue because this also makes me wonder if the Greek gods who originally defended the Earth from the alien invasion died silently when they were brutally murdered. This also makes me wonder if the boxes wouldn't have activated at all if Superman died quietly. Depending on which film you go by, the boxes are either activated by a variety of circumstances, which is a good design that makes sense for the aliens, but bad for the plot, or they are activated by an incredibly specific circumstance, which is good for the plot, but stupidly poorly designed to the point that no one would make them like that. And this is only one problem amongst many that the film has, and no amount of CGI or recolorings will fix that. So, once again, I ask myself if the Snyder Cut and all the fuss around its inception were worth it. Based on the amount of effort put into making the Snyder Cut look different from the first Justice League, and how little of that time was spent making the story good, I have to say no. No, it was not worth it. The real kick to the gonads in all this is the way everyone was played. All the problems that the 2017 Justice League had were attributed to everyone but the original creators. This gave Snyder and co. a get-out-of-jail-free card to deny any failures on their parts, and left the door open for the Snyder Cut to be made. The Snyder Cut was promised to be the original film, an artistic vision unsullied by corporate interference. But what we got was a heavily edited, bloated mess made in reaction to criticisms of the 2017 film and in fear that people might notice this is basically the same thing but longer. Despite this, people still sing the praises of the Snyder Cut, although I'm convinced at this point it's done out of self-denial. To top it all off, it has encouraged bad behaviour not only from fans, but from the film industry as well. Shortly after the Snyder Cut was released, demand rose for the uncut, original, artistic vision of the Suicide Squad to be released. Asking for Justice League to be re-released was one thing, but Suicide Squad as well? Is there an end point to all this? At some point, despite the film already having had an extended edition released, digital versions of Batman vs Superman had scenes changed to a 4:3 aspect ratio. As if somehow changing the aspect ratio of an existing film to match the Snyder Cut makes the film better? And then we had Morbius. Morbius is a film based on the Marvel comic book character of the same name and was released on the 1st of April 2022. Good date, by the way. It performed badly and made very little money, but it did garner a following online, mostly as a joke. Because of this online following, the film was re-released in cinemas 2 months later, in June 2022. It still performed badly and still made barely any money. I'm not saying this was definitely influenced by the Snyder Cut situation, but you can definitely draw parallels. The 2021 Snyder Cut version of the film Justice League was not worth the time, the effort, or the aggro. It was made on promises it never intended to keep. It took away good scenes from the 2017 release and re-edited the film for length and visuals that made no meaningful improvements. It encouraged negative behaviours which are still having an effect on the online ecosystem and the film industry to this day. And when all was said and done, not even half the people who wanted the film could be bothered to watch it to the end. I think I'd rather watch an 8-hour slog of a film about some very normal people and their money. At least I can be happy in the knowledge it was made with some artistic integrity. Thank you for watching this video. I tried to be as analytical as possible, but at some point my feelings on this came through somewhat. As a designer who often has to work to rules and regulations, it annoys me no end when someone can make whatever they want without anything holding them back and still make something as bad as Justice League. I'm sure everyone will have their own opinion on this subject, so feel free to leave a comment. You can also like and share and subscribe, and if I remember, I'll even make a dislike comment so you can let me know that too. I'll put my own artistic design skills to use in making Lovecraftian necklaces, link in the description to my Etsy store. I'm also going to start a Patreon account for anyone who wants to support my creativity. More on that soon. Once again, thank you for watching.